The Southern's passenger train stayed out of Amtrak for about a half dozen years, while the railroad's own trains, the Southern Crescent and Piedmont, shown in these vintage films, ran between Washington and Atlanta, with the Crescent continuing on to New Orleans. Streetcars blanketed Atlanta, with lines extending outside the city to Marietta and Stone Mountain. In 1902, all the lines were consolidated with the formation of the Georgia Railway and Power Company, today's Georgia Power. The company battled the inroads of automobiles by launching its first buses in 1926. Significant reductions of trolley service started in the 1930s, with gasoline buses and trackless trolleys often being the replacement. Finally, Atlanta's last streetcars ran on April 11, 1949. The final trackless trolley buses ran in 1962. Andy Cox, a longtime resident of Atlanta, recalls the trolley operations in and around East Point around 1917.
Railroad there where I lived was right at the south end of the industry yard, the switching yard, and there's 4 tracks of main line there that was in service almost all the time. And then in addition, on the west side of the railroad there was the Streetcar Service, which is 2 tracks, and that run parallel to the railroad from McCall's Crossing in Atlanta all the way down to through East Point and into College Park. At the lower end of East Point, they went into a underpass that the Hapeville line went out on the other to the east, going by what is now the airport area.
Mass rail transportation has not been totally banished from Atlanta. Removed from the streets in 1949, yes, but to return nearly 35 years later as Atlanta's modern rapid transit system, the Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, MARTA for short. Significant portions of the modern rapid transit system were built during the 1970s and 1980s alongside those wide historic rail arteries throughout the city. Peter Silcox, a CSX engineer who started with the Georgia Railroad in 1971, describes Atlanta's rapid transit construction.
Started with the Georgia Railroad, Atlanta West Point Railroad in 1971, and one of the first projects that I was assigned was the newly approved rapid transit system in the city of Atlanta. Started out of downtown Atlanta at underground, at grade alignment, and as it got over to the state office buildings, it went up onto an aerial structure and crossed over the railroad yard. And that was the first place we had to relocate the ladder portion of the freight yard so they could place the piers in and under the aerial structure. During this 5-year period of time, we relocated the main line of the Georgia Railroad from Moreland Avenue all the way out to East Lake. We had to move the main tracks over about 30 to 50 feet to make room for MARTA to run at grade along Decatur Street. And that was the most interesting phase of the work, to keep Georgia Railroad operational, the interchange with the then Seaboard Coastline and the Southern Railway, and still have this construction going forth. The final operations of the construction was the placing of the welded rail. It had been brought in and stockpiled at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, and then hauled by rail back out to Decatur, where we had a temporary connection between MARTA and the Georgia Railroad, so they could get the long strands of welded rail into and onto the railroad without going onto the aerial structure with an actual railroad train. The work progressed on schedule without any major delays in the 5-year construction. The rapid transit cars came in by rail to Decatur. And they were offloaded with trains. By 1978, they had cars in place so they could start testing the line.
By 1940, there were 15 main lines serving 8 railroad companies. Ridership on the trains was down slightly, as there were by now only 104 daily passenger trains. World War II did cause a substantial increase in passenger traffic, with continuous movement of troops and war material in and out of the area. The war was almost over when the nation was deeply saddened by the death of President Roosevelt. Atlantans were especially touched when the president's funeral train came through the city. Mayor Hartsfield presented flowers and expressed his sympathy to Mrs. Roosevelt. During and after World War II, steam locomotives were replaced by diesels in Atlanta and throughout the nation. Today, only a few lingering relics of this glory era of railroading, such as number 290, owned by the Atlanta chapter of the National Railway Historical Society, provide a long, nostalgic, present-day look at railroads past.
Steam locomotive is simply an interesting piece of machinery to look at and listen to. There's no doubt about that. And for many years, on some of the mainline railroads, a particular locomotive would be assigned to a particular engineer. Had his name on both sides of the cab. And he was very proud of that. He saw to it that the copper piping was kept shined up. Many of them carried Masonic emblems and otherwise. And of course that system went by the board when the locomotives had to cover more than one division, so no one man handled it after that. Anyway, in those days, the men who were assigned locomotives, many of them became distinctively known by their whistles. And one that I recall, his name was Oscar Garner, and he ran south out of Atlanta to Macon, leaving Atlanta early in the morning. And he had a very distinctive whistle. And many of our factories were located on the side of town that he had to go through to get to Macon. And many of them used Oscar Garner's whistle as an alarm clock, get up in the morning. And one day Mr. Garner laid off, and it said that every factory in that end of town that morning opened late.
The most important single development on the railroads that entered Atlanta was not their conversion to diesel power, but the mergers and consolidations of the many railroads which occurred between the 1960s and 1980s. You almost needed to have a scorecard to keep track as one railroad superseded another. The Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Air Line merged to become the Seaboard Coastline. The Georgia Railroad was acquired by the Seaboard Coastline, and the Seaboard, Louisville and Nashville, Atlanta and West Point, and Georgia railroads were merged into the Seaboard system in 1982, which then became CSX in 1986. The Southern Railway acquired control of the central of Georgia, with the Southern Railway and Norfolk and Western merging in 1982 to form Norfolk Southern. Traffic patterns were changed. Atlanta certainly was no longer a terminus, literally, as more and more trains rolled right on through the city to other points. Peter Silcox describes the impact of these consolidations on Atlanta area rail operations.
It is interesting to me to see how the railroads, which all terminated here in Atlanta, have now been combined into one system under CSX transportation. The L&N yard at Tilford was a terminating point of their operation and interchanged with the Seaboard Coastline at Howell Yard and interchanged with the Georgia Railroad at Halsey. Now, every train comes into Tilford Yard. Halsey Yard has been converted into the intermodal piggyback facility. Haul yard is a bids terminal where we unload for customers and truck it to their locations. So Tilford is the main location for all the trains to be built. We do interchange still with Norfolk Southern daily, but the yard was not designed for 150 car freight trains. Operations is very tedious to come down the steep grade from Marietta Boulevard into the south end of the yard, which was designed originally just for interchange 50 and 60 car trains. The Seaboard Coastline, or the old Seaboard Air Line yard, was on the main track going to Birmingham, and it was just an interchange track from Hall Yard through Howell Junction into Tilford. It is now converted into a main track, and the configuration has had to be changed around. The curves were sharp, the turnouts were number 8, number 10 turnouts, which are pretty sharp for the operation of a 150 car train. Plus the signals, TC signals, did not tie together. And when you got ready to bring a train into Tilford, you had to talk to the yard at Tilford and talk to Howell Junction, and it was all yard limit rules, which also adds to delays and problems in operation of trains. We have just recently completed tying all the train control systems into one dispatcher here in Atlanta, and actually installed signals to control the trains between the old Seaboard Coastline, the old L&N, and all the way into Halsey Yard. On the northwest side of Atlanta is the old Western Atlantic Railroad, state-owned, leased to CSX, and is our vital link out of the city to the north and northwest. It is our heaviest density line, with days when it runs from 45 to 50 trains a day, up to peaks of almost 60 trains a day. And at that density, on a single track railroad with a TC train control system, we're just about at capacity. The line being the first alignment into the city, it has the engineering standards of the first railroads, of flatter curves, less steep grades. Not knowing the strength of what a steam locomotive could pull, is well suited for the heavy, long tonnage trains that we operate today. But we are rapidly approaching the decision of having to double track more of the line so we can increase the capacity and keep it from becoming strangled.